Big storms are set to erupt this Memorial Day week for millions of Americans, and this video has the details on that, plus the general forecast across the country. I want to start today's video with a look at forecasted precipitation zones over 6-hour periods with a look at this blended guidance on screen. Let's start as we go out of our Sunday when I'm recording this and into our Memorial Day Monday, where it looks like if you are in these zones that I'm about to circle, you need to have some backup indoor plans for any outdoor plans that you may have. That is going to include parts of the plains and front range with a low pressure system set to develop as the day goes on. And then with a stalling boundary and a low pressure that will be closer to the southeast U.S., there is not going to be any sort of strong system in place on Monday, but that actually means that there is going to be a broader corridor where there could be showers and storms at any point in the day, including the morning, all the way through the midday time frame, and of course into where we get the best heating in the afternoon. From Nebraska down to Texas, from Texas to the Carolinas, and in points in between, really looks like you need to have some backup options, as I just mentioned, for any plans that you have on Memorial Day, unfortunately. But on the flip side, we're going to have some very dry areas. That includes a lot of the West Coast and even into some parts of the Intermountain West, the far north central plains, and then through the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and into the Northeast. Looks like a generally decent day to get outside, and I'll talk about some of the temperatures you could have for our Memorial Day. That will be a little later in the video. Pushing things out of our Monday and then into our Tuesday, May 27th, the low pressure system in the plains will begin to shift into some parts of the upper Midwest, and it will become the focal feature that we'll likely have to watch for the rest of the week, as it brings an isolated chance for showers as indicated by the low precipitation forecast in parts of the upper Midwest. It is going to bring some heavier showers where we get more moisture to its south and east, and that's especially going to ride along and behind this warm front that I just hashed out that will be moving up into some parts of the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic, and then ahead of this cold front that will be exiting the plains and will slowly move east as the week moves on. You can see from parts of Texas and Louisiana all the way along the Gulf Coast through the southeast and into some parts of the Tennessee Valley. That is going to be your best chance zone for widespread showers and storms, if not during the morning, then especially into the afternoon and evening of our Tuesday. And we'll get some more of those showers and storms in some parts of the East Coast and Mid-Atlantic as that warm front lifts through Tuesday night into Wednesday. Showers and storms will also be quite prevalent into parts of Wisconsin and Michigan, with the low pressure sitting directly overhead by the time we go into Wednesday. And then along and ahead of that general cold front that will be slowly moving east down to the low pressure system south, we could still see some isolated showers and storms through parts of the Tennessee Valley, and a better chance for storms where we get some moisture banking up against that front in places like Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi for yet another day going into our Wednesday. Of course, it's when you get these storms day by day that we could also see some flood threats try to go on the rise as the week rolls on. Even back into the high plains, some energy moving through could bring some showers and storms there. Some of those could translate down into some parts of the southern and central plains by Thursday. I'll talk a little bit later on in the video about how some of that energy moving out of the high plains could take a slightly different direction and impact parts of the Midwest as we finish this week. I mainly want to focus on Thursday and Friday in the east with the current forecast. And what it looks like is that low pressure system that I've been talking about moving from the plains and then shifting east will continue into southern Canada by Thursday, dragging along with it this cold frontal boundary that will generally be only impacting the Gulf and East Coast with the best chance of showers and storms by the time we go towards Thursday, as those zones will still be along and ahead of the front. Generally by Friday, most of the country looks to be drying out with the exception of the immediate Gulf and East Coasts, but that could change with that factor I was just mentioning that I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. Before I talk in more detail about anything later this week, though, I want to really focus on Monday through Wednesday's general threat for flooding, as well as some isolated to scattered severe weather in some particular zones. As we see the low pressure system moving out of parts of the plains and into the Midwest, it will be not only at the surface where we see that low pressure, but also as you go up many layers in the atmosphere. So that means that we're also going to see this mid-level jet stream that I'm looking at on screen really be affected. It is going to be noticeable that we have a low pressure system in place that is helping to direct this flow. You can see that as we see low pressure creating a hole in the jet stream, this cutoff energy that's going to be in some parts of the upper Midwest, underneath it from Tuesday into Wednesday, we're going to see a very strong flow from the southwest to the northeast, cutting up in multiple waves from parts of the southern and central plains over to the Ohio and Tennessee valleys and even the Mid-Atlantic. Underneath this flow is where we're going to have the most moisture getting pulled up, allowing for daily storm energy to support some flooding, as well as at least some isolated severe weather. Let's look at the severe weather probabilities for the next few days as indicated by this machine learning guidance on screen. This shows the percent chance of severe weather of any kind within 25 miles of a point, and you can see that especially in the southern plains where we will be closer to the energy being lifted north towards that forming low pressure system, that is where it is indicating the higher chance for some strong storms. This indicates from Dallas to Texarkana, maybe even on over to Jackson, Mississippi, and in points in between, about a 15% chance for especially wind and hail within 25 miles of a point. We could even see a small, around 2 to 5% chance of a tornado within 25 miles of a point, which that is above a zero threat, so be on the lookout for that from there, and maybe even with some isolated threats that could extend further to the southeast with a old front lingering in those zones. As we exit Memorial Day Monday and go into our Tuesday, May 27th, you can see the machine learning guidance is indicating, with low pressure pivoting on up into the upper Midwest and a lot of the southern and southeastern U.S. being behind that warm front and ahead of our cold front from Texas over into some parts of the deep south and southeast. Many spots will have a 5 to 15% chance of severe weather. That is equivalent to what the Storm Prediction Center would consider a slight risk in many cases. And on my ONW severe scale, if you know what that is, that I make custom made on this channel, I would consider that about a level 2 to level 3 of 7 in most cases. Then by the time we get towards our Wednesday, May 28th, along and ahead of that continued front that's likely going to be from the southern plains to the southeast, it looks like at least a 5% chance, which is a non-zero threat for severe weather, will be in place. So be on the lookout in those zones by that point in time. What about rain totals? Let's take a look at the 24-hour rain increments anticipated by the Weather Prediction Center's guidance as we get through the midweek time frame. Let's start with the time frame from around Monday early morning to our Tuesday early morning. This includes all of Monday and Monday night, where the best chance for storms will be between that boundary in the southeast U.S. and then where we'll see some of the storms underneath our low pressure system in the far southern plains. It looks like the best threat for over an inch to 2 inches of rain is going to be in this zone from Texas into the lower Mississippi Valley. This is an area that has been hit heavily with rain already in the last couple of days, so anticipate ongoing flooding to only be worsened and possibly for some new flooding concerns to also arise in some of these zones if they have not already. Elsewhere, very isolated flooding could be possible, but not as big of a threat in the southeast as what we'll see in a day like Tuesday into Tuesday night. This is the increment from Tuesday morning through Wednesday early morning, where especially some parts of the Tennessee Valley getting into the Appalachians looks to have the best chance of heavy rain. 1 to 3 inch rain totals look likely over a broad zone. An isolated locally higher amount also couldn't be ruled out in a place like Kentucky or West Virginia, so be on the lookout for some more flooding, especially in those zones by the time we get out of, again, Tuesday into early Wednesday. Here we go. This is the increment from Wednesday through Thursday early morning. Isolated flooding looks to continue to be possible in any of our heavier storms in the mid-Atlantic, down to the Gulf Coast, and possibly even into the far southern plains, although any widespread threats look to be eliminated by this point in time with broader corridors of showers and storms. As we push through Wednesday and beyond, that's when the forecast begins getting a little bit trickier, and I want to compare the European model to the GFS model now to show you what I mean. Let's start with the European model since it is similar to the blended guidance I showed with its ensemble counterpart earlier in the video. Here we go. You can see as we go out of Wednesday into Thursday, this guidance indicates that low pressure system I was talking about pivoting on up into parts of the Great Lakes region, and generally you can see how its front will still be draped along the east and then down to the Gulf Coast, but we will have a corridor where we will likely be especially cooler than average in terms of temperatures and drying out as we see the northwest to southeast flow behind the low pressure system cutting out of the upper Midwest and into parts of the mid-Mississippi Valley. While this guidance generally indicates that as we see the low pressure system trying to connect with a trough that's going to be moving into some parts of southeast Canada and the northeast U.S., the GFS model shows something completely different, and I want to show that to you right here on screen. In fact, you're looking at the GFS model now, and what you're going to notice is that as we see that general weak low pressure that's going to be around the Great Lakes out of Wednesday into Thursday dissolve, it indicates a new low pressure system with that energy that moved out of parts of the high plains. Instead of it getting squished under the first low pressure system's cold front, this energy continues to the east, and according to the GFS model, we could have a fairly strong front bringing showers and storms up and down the Mississippi Valley into some parts of the Ohio Valley and Tennessee valleys as we go out of Thursday into Friday. Much more activity in those zones. In fact, a lot more in comparison to the European model, which shows almost nothing by the time we get towards Thursday and Thursday night. We'll see how this shapes out, but either way, it carries a lot of our energy off the East Coast by Saturday and Sunday, as this GFS model does indicate that secondary system moving quite quickly. That's just a little bit of a difference we have to watch, though, for late week. I'll keep you updated in some way, shape, or form on what happens with that later week setup, but regardless of what happens, whether we have one or two main low pressure systems that impact this week's weather, whatever low pressure we have moving through the central and eastern U.S. later this week will be taken over and be pushed offshore eventually, because of some of this energy that is coming down out of central Canada that you can see on this screen right here as we look at the mid-level jet stream for Friday morning. Keep an eye on that piece of energy. That is a trough that's going to come down. It is connected all the way back to the polar jet stream in Canada, and it is going to bring down with it some cooler and much drier air in comparison to normal for this time of the year, and that is going to help in pushing any cold fronts offshore of the East Coast. Look at how that really moves in. That would likely push all systems offshore by the time we go out of Saturday into Sunday, with the exception of any wraparound energy behind low pressure temperatures that might still be in places like the Northeast US or the Midwest, for example. Overall, many zones in the eastern U.S. can expect to cool down and dry out at the latest by the time we get towards around Sunday with this kind of setup. So that is some good news, as we will clear out any rain and storm chances for at least a little while. With that being said, that leaves me with only temperatures to talk about as we finish this video, and I'm going to go through the rundown of high temperatures day by day. Use the key at the bottom of the screen in case I don't mention your area for each day. But you can certainly see as we go into our Monday, the broad trend is going to be some generally mild temperatures and much milder temperatures in comparison to normal for this time of the year in some parts of these central and eastern zones, as we see clouds and low pressure in place really keeping those numbers down. Look at some of these numbers we're going to have out of the high plains into the central plains. These catch my eye as we see some blues filling in on the screen, as well as some of those lighter yellows. 50s and 60s, we should probably be in the 70s and 80s at least this time of the year in some of these central plains zones, and even into the high plains, these 50s are very unusual in eastern Wyoming and northeastern Colorado. One zone I can tell you that is going to have a beautiful Memorial Day is going to be the west, where we're going to have 70s and 80s as well as dry conditions in many of the valleys. And then up here in the northeastern quadrant of the country, it is going to be a generally dry day on Monday before we see rain move in later this week, and we are going to have an abundance of 60s and 70s to go along with generally partly sunny skies from Minnesota to Maine and in points in between. Enjoy that weather and soak it up before we get the rain to move in. I can tell you it is going to be a wet week in a lot of the country, and that's why we're going to have so many 60s out of the plains and into the Midwest as low pressure and cloud cover. Even if it's not raining, we'll just keep those numbers down, even down into parts of the Carolinas, as we see some of those northeast to southwest moving winds coming down below the Appalachians. 50s and 60s could be a common theme in those zones, and even up into the mid-Atlantic with some of this cooler weather that we are going to see through the early to mid part of this week. The only zone really experiencing 80s likely on Tuesday, that's going to be down into parts of California, into parts of Arizona, where even some 90s could be in the mix, to even a 100-degree reading there in south central Arizona. Plenty of 80s and 90s will also be around down there closer to the Gulf Coast. And then Wednesday will likely do it all over again, a broad corridor of generally just 60s and 70s, even in some zones that should be in the 80s this time of the year, and then more 80s building back into the Mountain West, and some 80s into some parts of the Gulf Coast regions. Do it all over again on Thursday, and we'll do it all over again on Friday. Although I do want to mention on Friday, it does look like we could warm up a little bit more here in some parts of the central U.S. with a broad corridor of mid-70s. Let's see what this guidance is trying to show by the time we get towards Saturday. Can you see a little bit of that cool down trying to slide down? Yeah, the far eastern U.S. is likely to begin getting that by the time we get out of Saturday into Sunday, as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago. I can tell you, though, moving out of the west and towards the central plains, by the time we get towards the weekend, any ridging we see into parts of the Mountain West will only build, and we'll get more 80s and 90s and even some triple digits in the valleys, and we'll also see some 80s trying to fill towards the plains, as we see possibly what could be a warming trend in a lot of those zones. That will continue to cover 2/3 of the country, more than likely, as we get towards the first few days of June. With that being said, I want to end this video with the usual reminder to hit that subscribe button if you have not already. By the way, if you are subscribed to this channel, I did want to let you know that if you're looking out for videos into the week ahead, they might be few and far between, if they even exist at all, for the next 5 days or so, as I'm going on a Memorial Day week trip. I will be returning at the end of the week. Do not worry, I will be back with more videos then, but I might take a break from some videos while I'm gone, so just keep that in mind, and stay tuned for updates in places like the YouTube Shorts feed or in the community tab, as I might post some quick updates there to keep you in the know. While I'm gone, you can track the weather on your own, in your phone, on your computer, and a different device by going to the WeatherBell Model Maps free trial link and getting those maps. The link for that will be down in the description. Of course, again, I'll try to keep you updated, though. I'll see you when I get back. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone, and I'll catch you in the next update.